Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Today we continue our look through Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, in which we make sense of the Old Testament God. These are the contents of that book. Please pause the video and take a look at those contents if you like. Here's Paul Copan. He's the Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics at Palm Beach Atlantic University in Florida. He's written over 20 apologetics and philosophy books and lives in Florida. Today we look at Chapter 12 of Is God a Moral Monster, in which we see the first part about slavery, the issue of slavery in the Bible. The runaway slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass wrote in his autobiography about his first slave owner, someone by the name of Captain Anthony. Frederick Douglass quotes him and is quoted here and says, "He was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slaveholding. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I've often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an own aunt of mine whom he used to tie up to a joist and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. No words, no tears, no prayers from this gory victim seemed to move his iron heart from its bloody purpose. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped, and where the blood ran fastest he whipped there he whipped longest. He would whip her to make her scream and whip her to make her hush, and not until overcome with fatigue would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin. I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. I shall never forget it whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was the blood-stained gate, the entrance to the hell of slavery through which I was about to pass. It was a most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it." End quote from Frederick Douglass. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who lived in the 19th century, author of the powerful bestseller Uncle Tom's Cabin, wrote that Southern masters had absolute control over every facet of their slaves' lives. The legal power of the master amounts to an absolute despotism over body and soul, and there is no protection for the slave's life. So in this chapter, we're gonna take a look at what did Old Testament slavery actually look like. You hear New Atheists make statements about this Old Testament God that really amounts to a caricature, that really amounts to a straw man, because the picture of slavery that the New Atheists paint is not the biblical picture of Old Testament indentured service. A mistake critics make associating servanthood in the Old Testament with antebellum slavery in the South, like the kind of scenario Douglas described. They're not the same thing. You can't compare the Old Testament slavery with American Civil War slavery. By contrast, Hebrew debt servanthood could be compared to similar conditions in colonial America. Paying fares for passage to America was too costly for many individuals to afford, so they'd contract themselves out, working in households, often in apprentice-like positions, until they paid back their debts. So there you go. These people are agreeing to work for a master for a wage so they could pay back their debts. 1/2 to 2/3 of white immigrants to Britain's colonial colonies were indentured servants. Likewise, an Israelite strapped for shekels might become an indentured servant to pay off his debt to a boss or employer. Calling him a master is often way too strong a term, just as the term servant or employee typically shouldn't be translated slave. John Goldingay comments that there is nothing inherently lowly or undignified about about being an abed, a servant or an employee. Indeed, it is an honorable, dignified term. Even when the terms buy, sell, or acquire are used of servants or employees, they don't mean that the person in question was just property. Think of a sports player today who gets traded to another team to which he belongs. Yes, those sports teams have owners, but we're hardly talking about slavery here. Rather, these are formal contractual agreements, which is what we find in the Old Testament servanthood and employee arrangements. We find formal contractual agreements. One example of this contracted employee-employer relationship was Jacob's working for Laban for 7 years so that he might marry his daughter Rachel. In Israel, becoming a voluntary servant was commonly a starvation prevention measure. A person had no collateral other than himself, which meant either service or death. While most people worked in the family business, servants could contribute to the family business as domestic workers. Contrary to the critics, this servanthood wasn't much different experientially from paid employment in a cash economy like that of 21st century America. So again, when you hear the new atheists talk about this God advocated slavery, I don't want to serve a God who likes slaves and advocating slavery. We're not talking about the thing that the American Civil War was fought over. We're talking about something entirely different. Now, debt tended to come to families, not just individuals. Whether because of failed crops or serious indebtedness, a father could voluntarily enter into a contractual agreement or sell himself to work in the household of somebody else. Here's Leviticus chapter 25, verse 47. Now, if a sojourner or stranger close to you becomes rich, and one of your brethren who dwells by him becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger or sojourner close to you, or to a member of the stranger's family. So you could have sold yourself to make a living for your family. Perhaps his wife or children might be sold to help sustain the family through economically unbearable times. If his kinfolk didn't redeem him or pay off his debt, then he would work as a debt servant until he was released after 6 years. Family land would have to be mortgaged until the year of Jubilee every 50 years. Leviticus 25 spells out the successive stages of destitution in Israel. In other words, this servanthood was not imposed by an outsider as it was by slave traders and plantation owners in the antebellum South. What's more, this indentured service wasn't unusual in other parts of the ancient Near East either, though the conditions were often worse in other parts of the ancient Near East. And later on, when inhabitants of Judah took back Hebrew servants they had released, God condemned them for violating the law of Moses and forgetting that they were once slaves in Egypt whom God had delivered. God told the Judahites that because of their actions they were going to be exiled in the land of their enemies. Once a servant was released, he was free to pursue his own livelihood without any further obligations within that household. He returned to being a full participant in Israelite society. Becoming an indentured servant meant a slight step down the social ladder, but a person could step back up as a full citizen once the debt was paid or he was released in the 7th year or in the 50th year. Nevertheless, the law was concerned that indentured servants were to be treated as a man, hired from year to year, and were not to be ruled over ruthlessly. In fact, servants in Israel weren't cut off from society during their servitude, but were thoroughly embedded with it. As Copan mentioned earlier, Israel's forgiveness of debts every 7 years was fixed and thus intended to be far more consistent than that of Israel's ancient Near Eastern counterparts, for whom debt release, if it occurred, was typically much more sporadic. So unavoidable lifelong servanthood was prohibited unless someone loved the head of the household and wanted to attach himself to him, as in Exodus chapter 21 and verse 5. The servants, even if they hadn't paid off their debts, were granted release every 7th year with all debts forgiven, according to Deuteronomy chapter 15. As we'll see, their legal status was unique and a dramatic improvement over law codes in the ancient Near East. So the legal status that went on with this biblical indentured service was an improvement over other law codes in the ancient Near East. One scholar writes that Hebrew had no vocabulary of slavery, only vocabulary of servanthood. An Israelite servant's guaranteed release within 7 years was a control or regulation to prevent the abuse and institutionalizing of such positions. The release year reminded the Israelites that poverty-induced servanthood wasn't an ideal social arrangement. On the other hand, servanthood existed in Israel precisely because poverty existed. If there were no poverty, there would be no need for servants in Israel. And if servants lived in Israel, their servanthood was voluntary. They only became a servant because of their poverty. They were not forced to become a servant. They voluntarily chose to become a servant because of their poor conditions. So let's look at some means to help the poor. In the ancient world and beyond, chattel or property slavery had 3 characteristics. First, a slave was property. Second, a slave owner's rights over the slave person and work were total and absolute. Excuse me. Number 3, the slave was stripped of his identity, his racial identity, his familial identity, his social identity, and his marital identity. From what we've seen, this does not describe the Hebrew servant at all, nor does it, as we'll see in the next chapter, fit the non-Israelite slave in Israel. Israel's servant laws were concerned about controlling or regulating, not idealizing an inferior work arrangement. So it's a given that the work arrangement is inferior. It's understood when you're reading these Old Testament slavery passages. It's to be understood that the work arrangement is inferior, not something that is ideal. But the laws were there to help people from getting taken advantage of, from becoming too controlling. It was to help make things more manageable and humane. Now, did people abuse those? Of course they did. Israelite servitude was induced by poverty and was entered into voluntarily and was far from optimal. The intent of these laws was to combat potential abuses, not to institutionalize servitude. The laws were to prevent abuse, limit abuse, and were not a way to endorse servitude, endorse institutionalized servitude. When we compare Israel's servant system with the ancient Near East in general, what we have is a fairly tame and in many ways very attractive arrangement for impoverished Israelites. The servant laws aim to benefit and protect the poor, that is, those most likely to enter indentured service. Servanthood was voluntary. A who, for whatever reason, doesn't have land sells himself. Someone might also sell a family member as an indentured servant in another's household to work until a debt is paid off. Once a person was freed from his servant obligations, he had the status of full and unencumbered citizenship. Old Testament legislation sought to prevent voluntary debt servitude. A good deal of Mosaic legislation was given to protect the poor from even temporary indentured service. The poor were given opportunities to glean the edges of fields or pick lingering fruit on trees after their fellow Israelites harvested the land. Also, fellow Israelites were commanded to lend freely to the poor. The poor were not to be charged interest. And if the poor couldn't afford high-end sacrificial animals, they could sacrifice smaller, less expensive animals. Also, debts were to be automatically canceled every 7 years. In fact, when debt servants were released, they were to be generously provided for without a grudging heart. The bottom line is this: God didn't want there to be any poverty in Israel. Therefore, servant laws existed to help the poor, not to harm the poor or to keep them down. So here's the ultimate goal: that there would be no poverty, and that there would also not be servanthood. So here's this long quote of Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 1 through 18. Rather than me read this passage, why don't you pause the video now and read it to yourself? Okay, after having read Deuteronomy 15, 1 to 18, here are Copan's comments. The legislation commands the forgiveness of the poor person's servant's accumulated debt. The legislation commands the forgiveness of the accumulated debt. This debt remission was to take place every 7 years, which shows God's remarkable concern for the impoverished in the land. Now, some will point to various Mesopotamian kings during the 2nd millennium BC who released slaves and debtors during the 1st or 2nd year of their reign, and another time or more beyond that. But releases were typically sporadic, unlike the fixed intervals required in Israel every 7th and 15th year. If you just glanced over Deuteronomy 15 and didn't catch its significance, go back and really read it. The overriding revolutionary goal expressed in the text is to totally eradicate debt servanthood in the land. It says in verse 4 that there will be no poor and therefore no debt servanthood among you. Being a realist, however, God was aware that inferior conditions would exist because of human choices, and that poverty and thus servanthood would continue in the land. Even so, the undesirable situation was to be battled rather than institutionalized. In keeping with this eradicate poverty, eradicate servitude spirit, a servant's release was to be accompanied with generous provisions and a gracious spirit. So the master was to let the servant go and was to provide for that servant so the servant could start his new life. The master was to have no wicked thought toward his servant. Instead, he was to generously load him up with provisions. The motivating reason for this kindness and goodwill was that the Israelite master knew that they were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord their God redeemed them. Therefore, the master was to keep in mind their own slavery in Egypt and how God was gracious in releasing them as Egyptian slaves. So this master should be like God was to Israel in Egypt, and should be gracious to the slaves that this master was letting go of. Even if poverty and therefore servitude couldn't be eradicated, Israel was to strive toward the goal of eradicating poverty and servitude. So now we're going to look at the dignity of debt servants. Rather than relegating treatment of servants, slaves, to the end of the law code, commonly done in other ancient Near Eastern law codes, Israel's law code put the matter of servants and slaves front and center in Exodus 21. For the first time in the ancient Near East, legislation required treating servants as persons, not property. In other ancient Near Eastern cultures, it was the king who was the image of God on earth, and certainly not a slave. By contrast, Genesis chapter 1 affirms that all human beings are God's image bearers. So Israelite masters who were familiar with the creation story, which they would be if they grew up in the Israelite culture, they would be well familiar with the passage in Genesis that affirms that human beings are God's image bearers. This doctrine of human beings being God's image bearers serves as the basis for affirming the dignity and rights of every human, even slave. Likewise, Job 31, 13 through 15, clearly reveals the inescapable humanity and thus equality of master and slave alike. Here's what it says in Job 31, 13 through 15. If I have despised the cause of my male or female servant when they complained against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he punishes, how shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one fashion us in the womb? End quote. Servants or slaves in Israel, unlike their ancient Near Eastern contemporaries, were given radical, unprecedented legal human rights, even if not equaling that of free persons, who could, if unfortunate circumstances prevailed, find themselves needing to be placed in indentured servitude. As the Anchor Bible Dictionary essay on slavery observes, quote, we have in the Bible the first appeals in world literature to treat slaves as human beings for their own sake and not just in the interests of their masters. So once again, we don't see the abuses that the New Atheists claim assume that there are in the slavery arrangement in the Old Testament. The abuses that they think are there are not really there. Now, can people abuse the restraints that God has put on this? Of course they can. And can bad things happen as a result of human sin? Of course they can. But God's not to be blamed. By comparison, the idea of a slave as exclusively the object of rights and as a person outside regular society was apparently alien to the laws of the rest of the ancient Near East, where slaves were forcibly branded and tattooed for identification. Indeed, in contrast to many ancient doctrines, the Hebrew law was relatively mild towards slaves and recognized them as human beings subject to defense of intolerable acts, although not to the same extent as free persons. As we'll see, protection of runaway slaves who fled Israel was strikingly different from the slave laws in surrounding ancient Near Eastern cultures, and this was due to Israel's own history as slaves in Egypt. This fact would in effect turn slavery into a voluntary institution. Some will argue at this point that Hittite laws were softened when they were upgraded. They became more humanizing. True enough that the Hittite laws became more humanizing, but the results weren't always as positive as one might think. For example, murder carried with it the death sentence, except for slaves. Free persons were punished by fining and mutilation. The improvements were at best a mixed bag. In the rest of Copan's 12th chapter of Is God a Moral Monster, we'll see not only how 3 key laws in Israel were distinct in the ancient Near East, but also how, if they had been heeded by Bible-believing Southerners in America and Christian Europeans, slavery would not have been the issue that it was. So let's look at these more closely. First, the release of indentured servants. Another marked improvement of Israel's laws over other ancient Near Eastern law codes is the release of injured servants. When an employer or master accidentally gouged out the eye or knocked out the tooth of his male or female servant or employee, that servant was to go free. No bodily abuse of servants was permitted. As we'll discuss in the next chapter, if an employer's discipline resulted in the immediate death of a servant, that employer himself was put to death. That master himself was put to death. Note that the word for punished is very strong, always connoting the death penalty. By contrast, Hammurabi's code permitted the master to cut off his disobedient slave's ear. Typically, in ancient Near Eastern law codes, masters, not slaves, were merely financially compensated for injuries to their slaves. The Mosaic law, however, held masters accountable for their treatment of their own servants, not simply another person's servants. As we'll see shortly, if the servant died because of the employer's physical abuses, this was considered to be murder. All of this was unparalleled in other ancient Near Eastern law codes. Some might ask whether releasing a servant for gouging out an eye or a tooth is a better person for freeing servants than in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. After all, Hammurabi allowed for the release of a slave woman and her children, those sired by the master, if the master decided not to adopt them. Of course, the question itself is skewed. As we've seen, Israelites were to release their servants every 7 years unless the servants wanted to stay on. In 1 Chronicles chapter 2, Caleb's descendant, Sheshan, gave his daughter in marriage to his Egyptian servant, Jarha, which would not be a bad move up the social ladder. As an aside, keep in mind that many, perhaps most servants were young people who were parceled out by destitute parents to more prosperous families who would feed, clothe, and shelter them. Other adults served in loco parentis, in the place of parents. Other adults served in the place of parents, which typically included discipline of servant children. As Proverbs 29 puts it, a servant will not be corrected by mere words, for though he understands, he will not respond. The downside of this was that sometimes the head of the household would likely overdo the punishment, possibly resulting in injury. Now we're going to look at some anti-kidnapping laws. Another unique feature of the Mosaic Law is its condemnation of kidnapping a person to sell as a slave, which was an act punishable by death. He who kidnaps a man and sells him, or if he's found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. That's Exodus chapter 21, verse 16. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 7. If a man is found kidnapping any of his brethren of the children of Israel and mistreats him or sells him, then that kidnapper shall die, and you shall put away the evil from among you. Now note the prohibition of kidnapping in 1 Timothy 1:10. In the New Testament, it says that kidnapping was contrary to sound doctrine. This ban against kidnapping is a lost point or ignored by those who compared servanthood in Israel with slavery in the antebellum South, let alone in the ancient Near East. So now we're going to look at helping runaway slaves. Up to this point, we've primarily referred to Israelite servants, not just foreign servants. But this particular law reveals just how different Israel's laws were from the antebellum South. Despite the Confederacy's claims of following the Bible faithfully. Also, this fugitive harboring law would have applied to Israelite servants who left harsh employers for refuge. Another unique feature in Israel's slave laws was this: Israel was commanded to offer safe harbor to foreign runaway slaves. The southern states' fugitive law legally required runaway slaves to be returned to their masters. This sounds more like the Code of Hammurabi than the Bible. Hammurabi even demanded the death penalty for those helping runaway slaves. In other less severe cases, in the Lipit, Ishtar, Eshuna, and Hittite laws, fines were exacted for sheltering fugitive slaves. Some claimed that this was an improvement. Well, sort of an improvement. In these improved scenarios, quote-unquote improved scenarios, the slave was still merely property, and ancient Near Eastern extradition arrangements still required that a slave be returned to his master. And not only this, but the slave was going back to the harsh conditions that prompted him to run away in the first place. Even upgraded laws in first millennium BC Babylon included compensation to the owner, or perhaps something more severe, for harboring a runaway slave. Yet the slaves themselves were disfigured, including ears slit and being branded. This isn't the kind of improvement to publicize too widely. Yes, positive trends and moral improvements took place in ancient Near Eastern laws, but repeatedly we see a general, noteworthy moral difference between the Law of Moses and other ancient Near Eastern law codes. One more matter. Although some claim that the runaway slave in Deuteronomy 23 isn't a foreigner but an Israelite, we have plenty of reason to reject this idea. For one thing, no mention of the word brother or neighbor is used. In addition, according to Leviticus 25, Israelites weren't allowed to enslave fellow Israelites. Also, the foreign fugitive slave could freely choose a place to live in Israel, unlike the rest of the Israelites who had to stay put on the land allotted to clans. Thus, those who benefited weren't society's elite, but vulnerable, marginalized foreign persons in the midst of a completely different society. Furthermore, Israelites entered servitude voluntarily, whereas runaway slaves would likely have become slaves against their will. So, if alien slaves received protection from harsh masters, how much more would this be so for Israelites? Now we're going to make some summary comments. In Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address in 1865, we find these familiar words regarding the North and the South. Quote, "Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid, God's aid, against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us not judge that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has shown his purposes." End quote. Yet clearly both sides read from the same Bible, and sought divine support to overcome their adversaries. However, the critics' common association of servant laws with those of the antebellum South is seriously misguided. We can plainly affirm that if the three clear laws of the Old Testament had been followed in the South, that is, anti-kidnapping, anti-harm, and anti-slave return regulations in Exodus 21, Deuteronomy 23, and Deuteronomy 24, then slavery would not have arisen in America. If you had to choose between servanthood in Israel and slavery in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, the sane person would pick Israel every time. The indentured servanthood model wasn't ideal, but Israel's laws reflected a greater moral sensitivity than their ancient Near Eastern counterparts. In his classic theology of the Old Testament, Walter Icott summarizes the contrast well. Quote, "The norms given in the Book of the Covenant reveal, when compared with related law books of the ancient Near East, radical alterations in legal practice. In the evaluation of offenses against property, in the treatment of slaves, in the fixing of punishment for indirect offenses, and in the rejection of punishment by mutilation, the value of human life is recognized as incomparably greater than all material values. The dominant feature throughout is respect for the rights of everything that has a human face, and this means that views which predominate universally everywhere have been abandoned and new principles introduced into legal practice. Ultimately, this is possible only because of the profundity of insight hitherto underemphasized into the nobility of man, which is now recognized as a binding consideration for moral conduct. Hence, in Israel, even the rights of the lowliest foreigner are placed under the protection of God, and if he's also dependent without full legal rights, to oppress him is like oppressing the widow and the orphan, a transgression worthy of punishment which calls forth God's avenging retribution. End quote. In Israel, indentured servants or slaves were to be treated as human beings, not as property. They were protected from inhuman abuse. In the Old Testament law, though there was a distinction between a servant and a free person, a servant was certainly protected by the law. Abusing a servant would result in the servant's going free. In the 7th year, a servant would be debt-free and able to strike out his own new status as a free person. Though there were some release laws in ancient Near East, the contrast between Israel's laws and other laws are more striking than the similarities. The Israelites had 6 years of labor, the critic asks. Hammurabi had only 3. Generally speaking, though, in the ancient Near East, a slave's right of gaining freedom belonged exclusively to the slave owner. The Code of Hammurabi and other ancient Near Eastern law codes stress class distinctions and legislation corresponding to slaves, free persons, and government officials and priests, and so on. These ancient Near Eastern laws were quite unlike the fairly non-hierarchical Old Testament. In Israel, even kings like King David or King Ahab weren't above the law. Indeed, when they were guilty of murdering Uriah and Naboth, respectively, God's prophets confronted them for taking the innocent lives of 2 ordinary citizens. Though Canaanite kings assumed that the land belonged to them and their royal families, Naboth knew that the land belonged to God, which he graciously gave for Israelite families to use. Although God didn't use Israel's judicial system on kings, God certainly didn't give these kings a pass. God repeatedly brought severe judgments directly on the royal perpetrators of heinous crimes and acts of covenant disloyalty. God divided the kingdom because of Solomon's idolatry. He sent leprosy on Uzziah. He sent Manasseh into exile, and the list goes on. These incidents illustrate what Leviticus 19:15 commands. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great, but you are to judge your neighbor fairly, whether a king or an ordinary citizen. That's Leviticus 19:15. Yes, Israel's treatment of servants or slaves was unparalleled in the ancient Near East. Quote, no other ancient Near Eastern law has been found that holds a master to account for the treatment of his own slaves, as distinct from injury done to the slave of another master, and the otherwise universal law regarding runaway slaves that they must be sent back with severe penalties for those who failed to comply, end quote. Though Israel's laws on servitude weren't the moral ideal, they show far greater moral sensitivity than other ancient Near Eastern texts. In doing so, they point us back to God's ideal at the beginning, the ideal that all humans are God's image bearers. Contrary to what Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris say, servanthood in Israel can hardly be called a warrant for trafficking humans or a means for treating people like farm equipment. No. God's ultimate intention wasn't for humans to keep slaves. In fact, the Genesis ideal is that all humans are equal and that they do not work for another. Rather, each person under God's care is to be his own master, sitting under his own vine and fig tree. Next time, we're going to continue our look at slavery. We're going to look at some challenging texts on the topic of slavery in the Old Testament as we look at chapter 13 in Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God by Paul Copan. So thank you for watching today. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Please consider supporting my ministry by purchasing the volume on the first 30 chapters of the book of Psalms. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.